Welcome to the Equity Institute's podcast on the purpose of public education with me, your host, Vincent Perez. Today we have Christopher Daikos. I served with Chris at the Continua Consulting Group for 4 years, working on trauma-informed MTSS, the multi-tiered systems of support. Chris is dedicated to the well-being of students who are especially on the fringes and the margins, students in special education and students of color. Please welcome Chris Daikos. Chris, thank you for being here on our podcast series on the purpose of public education. I would like to start out, if you could just tell us a bit about who you are and then what is your connection to public education?
My first approach to public education, I was actually a volunteer in my son's kindergarten. I just got out of the Army. My son was starting school and I started volunteering there, and I really fell in love with education. In a kindergarten class and a first grade class, I'm learning like different ways of thinking about math. I'm thinking, wow, this is cool. And I want to really dive into this work. And then from there, I started teaching in special education with students with emotional behavior disorders. And in that process of helping students with emotional behavior disorders, I really learned about that. It's more about the environment of supporting those students and the environments in which some of our students were coming from. Some of those behaviors weren't translating well into schools. And so from that experience, I started bringing in services and supports for those students, like outside agencies. So bringing in social workers, counselors. Many of my students were aligned with they were in and out of adjudication, like they were in and out of incarceration, right? They were or on probation. And so I worked a lot with probation officers as well. And what I learned right there and then was that the diagnoses or like the identification for the need for the student really said very little about what and how do we best serve our students. And so from there, I went back to grad school, became a school administrator. After getting that certification, I was brought to a middle school in Seattle. My job under a grant to reduce disproportionality of school suspensions. Right away, I learned that suspension doesn't work. So forget the disproportionality, right? Like, let's just get rid of it. And let's bring our students closer into school. Let's call them in more versus pushing them away. I started working with a school psychologist, David Lewis, who is one of the biggest advocates of MTSS within the Seattle system. He and I started talking about how do we set up interventions to address the behavior. And when we're setting up that intervention, we started asking the question, why behind the behavior? Not like, I can't believe you did that or don't do that. The wonder of why. What are you trying to communicate? Discipline dropped significantly in that school. Unfortunately, it was during a lot of school budget cuts. And so we shut the school down. So from there, I decided, okay, time to go study psychology. I started working on my PhD towards ed psych. I got an EDS in it. I'm ABD, all but dissertation. I've been doing consulting ever since. And so we've been helping school systems across the country, but mostly in Washington State. We do a lot of work up in Snohomish County where we're helping school systems employ what's known as trauma-informed MTSS, bringing in trauma-informed practices. I can't stand that phrase because it sounds like trauma admiration, right, or problem admiration, but really what it is, it's based out of the medical field and understanding that you need to understand the individual that you are serving and their experiences, and from a constructivist standpoint of hearing that individual, understanding the individual if you are seeking to serve and come alongside and serve that. And so that's how we're helping school systems approach behavior, approach academics, and understanding that with that model, there has to be evidence-based practice. And if there's any evidence-based practice being implemented, you need to understand implementation science and how to do that. And so that's a lot of what we do within our work. It's a really long explanation of.
Well, it really shows your perspective in terms of working out with the systems of public education. So from the perspective of a school psychologist or a consultant helping teams to implement multi-tiered systems of support and really thinking about the need of students, I have the big question here that the whole podcast is about is, what do you believe the purpose of public is?
Yeah, you sent me the questions before, and that's really what drives me is like, what is the point of education? And so I went back to Horace Mann, right? Basically, not the, I hate using the word like founding father, but like one of the individuals who decided like, hey, you know what? We need a public school system that's common, right? So he looked at it as education as the equalizer within our society. And in Massachusetts, he started opening common schools, which is basically what our public education system is based off, the common school development in Massachusetts. Many schools around the nation had private, or, you had to pay a fee to get to it. But he was just like, you know what? Everybody gets this. Everybody gets to attend. It's a great equalizer. And he believed that would lead towards social harmony. And another thing that I believe, that when we look at the origin of our public school system across the board, when you read all the writings, it states that if you're going to have a democracy, you have to have an informed public. And I've often believed, and again, when we dig into the writings, schools are about social harmony and building citizenship. That was the charge. And I really question whether or not we're still fully informing our system to actually fully fund social harmony, to fully fund citizenship, to make sure that we have an informed public on how we're approaching our society. And if we don't have that within our school system, then good luck on holding on to a democracy. So I think schools are charged with making sure that we have citizens who are able to engage in the modern world. Even today. So the tech that what we're teaching today doesn't really match what the economy needs. But Horace Mann was saying that the common school is a system where every child gets a free, solid pathway towards working out of ignorance and into adulthood. And so, because he was referring to youth as ignorance. And that is exactly what we should be doing, is making sure that we are ready for our society. And I just don't really see us doing that right now. Maybe in some pockets, but as a system, no.
Some of the language I've come to when I think about the purpose of public education is foster stable human beings.
Yeah.
And so what does that mean? So it's in a lot of the language out there, right? It's pair, civic engagement. But then the question for me comes, well, what skills and knowledge and attributes do we need to foster to grow as students in order to be adults in our culture?
Right.
And I'm looking at the last 100 years of just pure innovation outside of any kind of social movements or that aspect, just in 100 years, right? We're coming off of industrial revolution. You get the cars already kind of coming in, but then you get flight, you get antibiotic, we get birth control, we get machines of war, right? Just pure invention, right? The nuclear power, and then comes the personal computer, internet, and now AI and social media and smartphones, all that kind of in the last 20, 30 years, just a rush. But we've been doing schools the same.
We're doing school on the 19th century industrial revolution type model. It's just a bell system, repetitive tasks. Much of the coursework doesn't necessarily align with what, when you do the World Economics jobs reports and you look at what basically they're stating that we need, it's really not there, except the only thing in STEM, what are the things? So the 2023 World Economics jobs report form states that they want analytical thinking, they want creativity, resilience and cognitive flexibility, self-awareness, curiosity, and novelty. These are skills. These are skills developments that I'm talking about. Curiosity, right? That's amazing. Dependability and organization, technology literacy, empathy and perspective taking. That blew me away when that was listed.
SEL, right?
Empathy and perspective taking, and social influence. They want people to understand how to actually influence people around them, which of course means that you need to have empathy, right? If you're going to influence people around you, you need more perspective taking if you're influencing people around you. And yet there's nothing in here about think about the coursework that students are engaged in right now. Very little is within this. But as you were just suggesting, sounds a lot like SEL. Sounds a lot about social emotional learning, which is nothing new, by the way. It's been around for a century. There's nothing new here about SEL. It's just a hot topic right now. But even way back in the day, SEL was a component for leadership. And when you start digging into the history of it, it actually came out of economics and business world. So they saw the value of that within where they're working so they can make more money, not for social harmony necessarily. It was more about the profit line. And now we're thinking, maybe this helps leads towards social harmony. But what are they asking for also within this? They're asking about more or less social harmony because you want to be able to have perspective taking, empathy, self-awareness. This is all SEL.
When we get to kind of the points of this project, of this podcast, are there any specific educational approaches, theories, frameworks? What are the solutions that you think education should be investing in and exploring?
That's a Good question. I really think that the way we're doing, I think the way we're doing social emotional learning right now within school systems that are embracing it, because that is a big undertaking right now, and it's a big shift within education. They're looking at it as like a solo curriculum. It's like a standalone curriculum that's taught occasionally, or I see that as something that needs to be across all systems. So all coursework, it needs to be integrated within it. The reason why social emotional learning needs to be emphasized more is that we have been watching for, 50 years now, 40 years of an anxiety trend across our society that's been going through the roof. Suicidal ideation is through the roof right now. And I really think our species is reacting to significant shift in our environment, being how we engage and work. Our actual physical environment is going through a flux. Call that climate change, call that global warming, whatever you want to call it, whatever the cause you think it is, it's happening. So there's a flux going on. And as a species, I think we're reacting to that. And that may be why there are some increased anxiety. That may be why that there is this need for social emotional learning right now. We've been individualized. One, we're in a very individualistic culture, but we've been individualized and isolated so much by our tech, so much by how we are engaging with each other, that once again, that's needed. And so I see that needing to be across all curricula. It needs to be a component for everything. And all it is instilling resilience. It's instilling perspective taking, and it's instilling the ability to step back and employ realistic thinking when we're experiencing those anxieties. So that's one thing that I see needed within the school systems just to succeed, just to have our kids feel like they belong there. Because when you look at attendance across the system, especially post-COVID, it's down significantly. So that's way of increasing a sense of belonging for our youth to be in school. But we also need to be thinking about how we're even approaching how we study. It shouldn't be just sit and get. There's very few jobs nowadays where it's just sit and get, right? Like it is, you're moving around, you're collaborating, and that's not just the white collar tech world, right? That's everybody right now. That's how we work now. So understanding that we need to shift even what it looks like. I think structurally things need to be completely changed. The way we even think of schools, I think schools need to be considered more about community centers versus just a place where students go, because again, nothing is as siloed anymore except our social interactions. Jobs aren't siloed the way they used to be. The way we collaborate and work is no longer siloed or isolated in one area. So we need to understand that collaborative process, and the school day should reflect what the work day may look like for youth in the future. Mm-hmm. I think the way we are using our testing and metrics don't really measure the successes that we're looking for. Again, when you look at what the Economic Forum 2023 jobs report from the World Economic Forum, it's not all about STEM, right? It's not all about like rote memorization. It is about curiosity, self-awareness, cognitive flexibility. Like that is not in your typical math course the way it's taught nowadays. So I also think that if there's going to be a real shift in the way we approach, it needs to be more of a constructivist model. Understanding what our students are bringing in as well, because kids learn so much outside of school nowadays. So how are we bringing that learning in, flipping the classroom to where students can help lead what they're learning and potentially contribute to it, kind of like with the guidance of the instructor versus the sage on a stage and sit and get. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of now. Right?
This actually is really interesting to me. So there was a lot there. Part of what I heard was dealing with stress. I mean, just basics, right? What are the skill sets to deal with the stressors of life now and in the future? Last spring, I was with about 90 middle schoolers from different schools, and I asked, what hardships do you know you're going to face? And they named it all. Divorce. In one school, a student had completed suicide. So they're talking about loss and grief. In this middle school, and they also named things like abuse and addiction. They already know, right? Middle school. They're middle school and they're already seeing life either being dealt with or not well, depending on the adults around them. Mm-hmm. So there's that whole component we kind of mentioned in SEL. There's the component of collaboration and basically being a person with other people to get things done. So then from a constructivist perspective, if a student goes to school, what do you envision a school day looking like? I don't imagine it's a 6-period school day.
Right. Yeah, I'm really wondering about like project-based learning type approach. So this is one thing I never went to Evergreen, but I've always admired Evergreen College and how they'll just take a topic like nutrition, and you're looking at it from the economic perspective, you're looking at it from the historic perspective, you're looking from the cultural perspective, you're looking at it from the nutrition perspective, right? So like there's a multitude of approaches on how to approach this one topic, and I really think that is going to be how we're able to excite students with basically project-based learning.
Yeah, project-based.
So it's not one answer, right? It's not one solution, but that's one approach.
And interdisciplinary.
Yes. Again, we can't just silo it. We can't just, sit and we're only going to talk about sentence structure today, and that's it.
That makes me think about like you're in a math class and a student says, why are we learning this? I'm never going to apply this. Versus in this project, what statistics, what math are we applying to get to the answer we're
I immediately see how this is applicable to something in society, to something how I may engage with. This is now applicable to understanding that if I want to get X, Y, and Z done, I do need to understand this one mathematical equation because it will help me succeed something I'm trying to achieve. Versus, hey, I got the right answer, or whoops, I got the wrong answer. And what does that mean?
Yeah, there's a whole lot there about what is learning, what is knowledge construction. But I'm curious about what are you seeing successes? Are you seeing any institutions really like innovating and trying new things?
Yeah, we it's very unique from district to district. Like we're seeing seeing systems like very rural districts like embrace like small places actually understanding that this MTSS approach actually results in making less work for them down the road. Communities and districts that you wouldn't necessarily think would fully embrace social emotional learning. For example, so a rural district in Western Washington, logging community, highly impacted by the reduction in the logging community as far as work, and really not getting the federal support that promised for some of those districts when they
really an impoverished rural district.
Yes, very. And they're realizing that social emotional learning, for example, is what is needed within that community to help students succeed and become more resilient in life. I'm always amused or intrigued by the whole debate between grit and resilience. And I understand the grit, like the book. I'm not talking about the book, right? I'm just talking about the phrase and the terminology and their understanding. So like coming to them and helping phrase what social emotional learning more or less is, and how that can be supportive, and just getting past all the politics of it. And so seeing communities like that embrace it and actually see reduction of absenteeism, reduction of our suicidal ideation, reduction of like all of these like stressors or responses to stressors, like so stress responses that are maladaptive. In other words, I'm experiencing stress. So what do? I don't necessarily take on the project or whatever I'm stressed out about. I just go off and smoke a joint or have a drink. And that's my negative stress response. So students starting to understand in those moments how to dissect that stress moment and understand how to respond to it. That is where I see a lot of shift, change, and power within students right now. So just bringing in SEL alone and getting beyond the politics of it that's been taken on by like people like Christopher Rufo or provocateur.
Which is really peculiar to me in terms of our humanity. Really thinking about, again, being people with people. How are we going to prepare students to deal with the hardships of life? Does K-12 do that? You want to ask students that? How is school preparing you to deal with the hardships of life? They're like, well, actually, school is creating some of the hardships.
Right.
School is the place where harm is being done, not where healing is occurring. But how can schools then, what I hear from you in my kind of in my language around like healing community, can schools be places of community learning where the skill sets, exactly when you said dissect that stress moment and understand what are the choices I have instead of overwhelmed, how can I lean into this and deal with, that's the skill, right? It's to actually face and deal with the problem and get through it. Yeah. And part of that is asking for help. That's a skill, right? So all of these things, what are the actual applications in a school day, right? To me, the challenges of bells and just the kind of structure it has doesn't really allow for students to say, hey, I need a mental health break. Right. Where do I go for that? Who do I go to for that? Right. So are there systems, are there protocols that you're seeing where students can be self-aware? I'm identifying something's happening. Last night, this thing went down at home. It's still on my mind. Whatever however the situation, this person called me a name, all the things that our young people deal with. What kinds of implementation practices or practices do you see being implemented to help students deal with that?
Well, the implementation of social emotional learning on a tier 1 level alone, right? Like when you're talking about implementation, right? Like that alone being done with fidelity is where students are going to be able to understand that, okay, somebody called me X, Y, and Z, and I've been learning this skill on actually how to pause for a moment, shift on whatever that experience is, and actually get back into the work. So it's not like an actual physical space, but it's actually a skill development, right? Like it's not saying like you can leave right now and go do this, but it is about that skill development of understanding what is the function of the behavior that I'm engaging with right now, because my parents are going through divorce and I'm having anxiety about that. So what is the function of this anxiety? Well, anxiety isn't necessarily always a bad thing. Anxiety, and it's not, and it doesn't, and one thing I love right now that we're helping do is help students realize you are not anxiety. Right? And we're seeing that a lot with Gen Z and younger millennials. I'm very happy that we're having this conversation more about mental health. I'm glad that we have a curiosity about mental health, especially among youth. And youth need to understand that that mental health component doesn't define who they are, nor is it a crippling experience. And so when we employ things like social emotional learning and go deeper with it, especially within the academics, so ideally educators are embracing this and understanding, like within literature, how to point out that, oh, this character is experiencing depression right now. Let's talk about that. What is the point of depression? Well, actually, there's a function. Depression is actually telling you to slow down, assess what's going on, and hopefully have the skill capacity to shift or correct or change whatever that element is that's leading towards your depression. So it should be empowering versus like I am depression, I am anxiety. And so where I see the implementation component again is that this isn't just for the students. It's also changing the environment of the school because educators are learning as well. You and I are old enough, Vince, where we didn't get this, right, at school. Like it was just shut up, suck it up, and deal with it, right? That was it. Done.
That makes me wonder about, like, you can't teach what you don't know, right? So how are the adults then acquiring the skills to teach the students?
And so this is a trend that I'm seeing in social emotional learning curricula as well, is that they're starting to produce adult SEL. And I kind of view that as like a more money-making moment for a publishing company, right? It's not really, because it's all the same skills. So whatever we're teaching adults and whenever we're teaching youth, yes, there's different experiences, of course, right? There's different ways to employ and learn, but the skill in itself is a skill that you're using throughout your whole life.
This reminds me, if you could speak to when COVID first occurred and all the schools shut down, and Continua was engaging on Zoom then with groups of teachers around locus of control.
Right.
Yeah, just what were the benefits of that for the educators? And could you speak a little bit about what you presented and then what the response was to that?
And most listeners are like, this isn't going to be earth-shattering information, right? And often within psychology, the most simple concept is the one that's actually most effective because it's kind of common sense, right? And it's just making sense of common sense. So educators at the time, just like all of us, were feeling completely overwhelmed when COVID hit and everything's being shut down. And educators had the additional stress of economies and families and communities view schools as their daycare. And everybody wanted to get the kids right back in school before we really even knew what we were dealing with. One, also how to keep everybody safe in the school at the same time. So we're trying to shove all these kids into these buildings with older adults, many of whom are medically fragile, and we didn't have a vaccine yet, and we're still trying to figure this all out. And so teachers were feeling incredibly overwhelmed. Of course, there's a lot of mis and disinformation going on about school closures as well, politically motivated, to erode trust in public school systems. We can hold different podcast on that, I'm sure.
Right.
So where's the funding, right? That's what that is all about. So teachers were completely overwhelmed. One, they had their families that they're trying to keep safe. They're trying to keep themselves safe. They're trying to keep students safe. And they're being told, get school going. And at the same time, some of them are online in the Zoom meeting and they're trying to learn this new tech. So if you could only imagine how overwhelming that is. And in that complete chaos, chaos, we were really helpful by bringing in perspective on that, understanding sphere of control, sphere of influence, or you have no influence whatsoever, just let it go. And that really helped a lot of educators to kind of go through this model and more or less place in what we did is kind of like just give them like circles, right? In the center is what you can completely control. Around that is what you can influence. And outside of that is what's out of your control. And just going through the process of just labeling what belongs where was so anxiety reducing for them significantly. It was like a lifeline. And again, it's such a simple concept, but if you're not practiced at employing that skill development in those moments of stress, then you're not going to do it. And so we help them kind of myelinate that behavior. Myelinate being like pathway of thinking. And so building that installation around it because you've practiced it over and over again. And still today, we hear educators that we've worked with saying, hey, I still use this. When they're
I think
stress at work.
the concept is very helpful just in its own, but the utility, the real practice is when they worked it together, right?
Yeah.
And process together and shared in that learning about what to let go of and feeling a bit of relief. So I've been considering dosage a lot. Like I've been really for like a year, I've been thinking about, we put our hand on our heart. I did for K-12 and pledged to the flag. And I could probably walk into any mall or supermarket USA and just say, I pledge allegiance, and then everybody could follow with you, right? So tiny bit of dosage every day through K-12. What would that look like for SEL? What's the little dosage? What's
that's what we're thinking of doing. So we're actually in the process of starting to develop a curriculum, and we want to do those tiny doses. And again, I think it's not in just your humanities class, and that's the teacher who's doing SEL. It is in every class. Yep. So ideally, that tiny dosage of sphere of control and influence, right? Like, and understand like how to slow down for a moment and understand that you're going to be able to get through this. And if you can slow your thinking, you're going to be okay. And so if you could have that even in your math class, if you could have that in your social studies class, if you could have that in your science and your whatever it is, right? Like whatever class it is, everybody's getting the same message in those classes in small doses. It's a reminder. So when the bells start, like right at the beginning of that class, it's just a quick reminder of, hey, remember the skill that we're all working on. Here's how that employs to math. Here's how that employs to civics.
I've been really thinking about this last question and what do I really want, but I've been wondering about the impact. And the question is, for me, framed, about spirit. So like, what impact did school have on you? But what did it really do for your spirit? Like, your psyche, your well-being, your self-worth, your concept of self. Like, how did school impact you in that way?
My school experience?
Your schooling experience.
My schooling experience was not the best. I was in public school up until 9th grade or 10th grade. And I was identified with dyslexia, ADHD in the 70s. And so special ed back then was in its infancy and not a good experience at all. Felt like an outsider, felt like other often. Started off school in New York and moved down to Virginia. And I had a funny New York accent and had a speech impediment and total outsider in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Had to like walk to my special ed class out to the portable so like everybody could see me, and it's like, oh, there goes a dumb kid, wave at him. So I felt like I had like a short bus experience, for lack of a better word. And I really felt like an outsider. I felt like school really wasn't teaching me, even though I had a reading disability, I loved reading. Even though I had a speech impediment, I wanted to be in theater and perform. So it was kind of like, I've always looked back and thought like, that's kind of interesting. Like I really struggle with reading, but I love reading books. I struggle public speaking, but I speak public. Like I do keynotes and present to audiences, and yet I still get incredibly nervous. And some reason, I guess I'm a masochist. I don't know. But that experience definitely made me feel like an outsider. Wanted nothing to do with public. I played hockey, so I got picked up by a school to go play hockey with, finish out high school. But I was lucky for that.
Did you then have a very different experience in terms of belonging? It sounds like school up until that you didn't feel like you belonged. Was there something with the team that you felt that, or still no?
Not really. Like I felt like an outsider on the team because I'm coming up from Virginia, and they're looking at me like, who the heck are you? You can't play hockey. So, and then, I just never, it was kind of interesting. Then being an Albanian Orthodox kid was also kind of like definitely an outsider. Didn't even know where Albania is. I don't think most people do still. So that was definitely kind of like felt like an outsider, and then never thought about going into education as a career, even though my grandfather was an educator and my great-great-grandfather influenced a lot of education in Albania. I never felt smart enough to be an educator. But then when I went into my son's elementary and volunteered, I just fell in love with it again. And I really think it's because the approaches they were using at his school were so unique and different on thinking. So like there was a new shift on like how you approach math my son's 27. So this is like 22 years ago. And when I'm always going to come back to this and like where I fell in love with education again was when there was a math lesson and it was looking at different ways to come to the same solution. And I was never taught that as a kid, right? Like it was just like, this is the formula. This is how you do it. This approach was, hey, we're getting to this. How do you get there? And so different, like there was like 5 or 6, and there's like 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, right? Like blow my mind, like on, oh, you approached it this way. Oh, you broke it down this way. And that's where I really started getting curious about instruction and how we all learn differently. And that constructivist moment where the teacher's asking, Vincent, how did you get to this solution? Versus here's one right answer. And we don't want to hear the wrong answer, or understanding that mistakes and failure in that moment is actually a learning moment. So Lynn Beebe was his teacher. I'll never forget her. She was incredible. Lynn was, again, like from the constructivist standpoint, trying to understand that kid's understanding of this formula or this problem or trying to get to it and wanting to bring in theirs, use that as an example, even though they didn't get the right answer, right, quote unquote, right answer, right? Yet, hey, let's think about this process of thinking that this child is producing for us. And that was such a beautiful moment where I was just like, all right, I'm sold. I'm going in.
Wow. I can imagine where your career would be if they'd never gone to that class.
Right. Yeah. 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 It's a good question. What was I doing then? I was writing and I just left the EPA. Bush got rid of my job.
It's a beautiful story, though. I found my pathway as an educator in my son's kindergarten class. Appreciate your time, Chris. Thank you for being on our little podcast series.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Yeah, I'm really grateful for you clearly have a passion here for youth and students and structure and learning. So I just appreciate your perspective and your care.
Thank you. I obviously, same to you, man. You've definitely done a lot of amazing work. I don't know if you share with the listeners, we worked together for a while, but seeing you taking off and going with the Equity Institute and all the work you're doing, you definitely have a passion.
Thank you.